what I did. It was important to me to consider a number of different factors, but I think what really struck me, and I'm sure I share this sentiment with many of you, when I first heard about this idea, the opportunity, I was, besides being struck by the magnitude of it and how serious of a chance it was, the first thought I had was just surprised about the freedom being offered in this idea, this opportunity, the ability to pick any asset class, a market of your choice that you have passion for, and getting an incredible head start within it from an entrepreneurial point of view. And so I think naturally the last place my mind went was healthcare. I was thinking about all these different things that I had passion for and interest in. And I kind of found myself with two competing values or ideals that I was looking for in a potential direction. One being a really organic, genuine interest in something. And then the other being belief in the market potential within that asset. Believing that it was well suited towards this opportunity, which is, an M&A style roll-up acquisition scenario, building a platform. And so I found myself actually struggling with the juxtaposition between those two ideals. And I essentially found myself valuing the second far more, looking for high potential markets that I thought I could be successful in. And I had some good ideas, and I went pretty deep down some of those rabbit holes and reached a point of being excited about plenty of the directions I could take, but I couldn't find conviction about a path forward. And that really bothered me. At the end of the day, this opportunity is massive. And for me, I wasn't comfortable going with something that I didn't have total conviction for. And then one day, I was a weekend day. I spent the day doing, reviewing financials for a plastic surgery group and putting together an adjusted EBITDA calculation, writing a proposal, and then eventually sending that off that evening. And I had this moment to myself where I kind of reflected on the day, and I realized how much I enjoy doing this and how motivating and engaging the experience is being in the plastic surgery space. And it makes sense to me. I'm a child of healthcare. Come from a healthcare family. My mom's a nurse. My dad's a physician who started 2 practices in my lifetime. And I got to kind of grow up around that world, getting to watch him start a practice, start 2 practices, sell one off, take advantage of opportunities, let some slip away, make good decisions, make bad decisions, struggle, and that dynamic that a lot of physicians that we speak to on a daily basis find themselves in, of wanting to spend their effort and their time on why they got involved in the trade to begin with, which is giving extraordinary care to patients. But then being tasked with running a business as well and having people's livelihoods at your direct control in terms of the decisions that you make. And so that dynamic was always apparent to me. And it was one of the reasons why I was so excited about getting to work for KVLR, which was this intersection between healthcare and private equity. And I had a moment of realization that this is the space that I care the most about. It's the one that I want to be involved in for at least the next 5 to 7 years. It's the thing that I think I'm good at, and it's the thing that I have a lot of perspective in. And of course, while at KVLR, plastic surgery has essentially been the only thing I've done. Getting to build out this national platform with David has been one of the most motivational and really exciting things I've been a part of. And I just couldn't imagine, once this idea came to me, going any other direction than this. So with all that said, I am pitching a different kind of plastic surgery platform. So the market, I find it a little ironic that I'm pitching the market and the asset of plastic surgery to KVLR, considering that we all know how valuable it is, and we certainly respect it a lot and consider it to be one of the most valuable assets that we can go after. But for due diligence sake and for setting the rest of this up, I think it's important to touch. The 2021 plastic surgery market size is about $20 billion, and there's projected US 2021 growth of about 7.5%. Now that number fluctuates depending on where you look, but the most stable number that I could find, according to studies and different metrics, was that 7 to 7.5 range. So I feel confident about that. There's a projected global plastic surgery market compound annual growth rate of 8.8% through 2027, our investment horizon, an expected global market of close to 70 billion by 2025. The growth in plastic surgery is outperforming that of some of the biggest subsets of healthcare out there, outperforming primary care, women's healthcare, pulmonology, oncology, pediatrics, and a handful more. So it's really increasing in terms of market growth year over year at a rate that's outperforming its competitors. And some of the key drivers for this really significant increase, because 2015 to 2019, the market growth rate was around 2.6%. And suddenly at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, this massive explosion happened in plastic surgery. And there are a few reasons for that. I think the drivers include increasing per capita disposable income. Plastic surgery is in a largely elective choice. A lot of the patient pool in plastic surgery are there on an elective base. And because of that, one of the key drivers for increasing patient pool is increasing per capita disposable income. So as that's increased, so too has a number of people who are beginning to consider plastic surgery as a viable option for themselves. There's also a lessening social stigmatization that's occurring, a little bit of a cultural dynamic in our country and certainly around the world as well. 15 years ago, the choice to have an elective aesthetic procedure done through plastic surgery might have been looked down upon to a certain degree, some level of social stigmatization, and that's definitely lessening. Year over year, it's increasing, and I think it's exponentially decreasing in terms of the stigma, and will continue to do so in the next 5 to 7 years. There's also a widening demographic interest. One of the most exciting things about the space currently is that, a space that has been historically dominated by wealthy white women is now suddenly being considered by a number of different demographic groups, ranging from men to minority groups. So certainly the actual base of people who are now considering plastic surgery as a viable option for themselves moving forward is increasing year over year. So certainly a lot to be excited about there. And then lastly, there's an increasing application across patient populations, meaning, while 85% of plastic surgery tends to be elective, there is that 15% that it's growing. People who have actually diagnosed medical issues across a spectrum of different issues are considering plastic surgery as a treatment 1 or treatment 2 option for themselves. So a lot of growth across a lot of different markets there. So very exciting in plastic surgery. Now, in terms of the asset, there are of course strengths and weaknesses. It's important to identify both. Beginning with the strengths, there's significant margins relative to other specialties, and it's largely cash-based with insignificant reliance on payers. And that results in really attractive cash flows, and there's no dreaded accounts receivables dynamics there. And so those two things are really unique relative to other specialties in medicine. Significant margins means there's more of a margin for error. It means we can reinvest the profits right back into a growth strategy. So that's certainly an attractive aspect of this market and this asset class. And then being largely cash-based, not only are there great cash flows, but there's no dynamic of the accounts receivable dread that many practices that I've talked to have to deal with in primary care or pulmonology. It's a dynamic in which you're incurring the cost of goods sold and expenses for a service provided, and you're not compensated for it for, in some cases, months at a time, or you eat the costs and you never get paid. So certainly at exit, that makes things a little bit easier on our end, but also in terms of actually having an asset, very attractive quality. There's protection from socialization relative to other specialties. Now, this is an interesting one because in healthcare being so heavily regulated compared to other asset classes, actually having an asset within that market that isn't affected by the potential for socialization of medicine is huge. I firmly believe that plastic surgery, despite what happens on the federal level, will remain a private practice. The fact that it's so massively elective, the fact that it's cash-based, the fact that the surgeons who are involved in it are typically the top of their class, looking to perform really high levels of work, means that it's not going to be socialized to the same degree places like primary care or pulmonology or oncology would be. In terms of proportion of elective usage, it results in immunity from external events. 2020 was a great lesson to many people in the healthcare industry. Of COVID, a global pandemic can wipe out essentially any market that exists outside of maybe PPV manufacturers or something like that. But plastic surgery was the only asset class that I've spoken to that actually outperformed 2019 numbers in 2020. Even considering that the majority of the ones that I spoke to were shut down for weeks or months at a time, and then for weeks or months after that, we're operating at 50% capacity in their ORs, and they still outperform 2019 numbers significantly. So you see a stabilization of this asset that's very attractive. And it's also, because the client base is largely people who are, within that +1 standard deviation from the mean in terms of per capita income, you have people who are going to have disposable income with or without market fluctuation to a large extent. So a very safe asset in terms of the patient pool always being there, independent of any external factors. Now, one of the most attractive things about plastic surgery as an asset class is the fragmentation of the market. And the reason it's such a fragmented asset relative to things like primary care or pulmonology is that hospital systems and healthcare systems really have no interest in trying to acquire plastic surgery groups, or if they do, it's certainly to a lesser extent than these other groups. And because of that, you have a lot of single players out there, private practices, and it really plays right into our hand in terms of an acquisition or roll-up strategy, which is certainly my platform idea and certainly a KBLR strategy as well. And then lastly, and this is the most important differentiator in my platform versus the one that KBLR is currently building, there's a consistent and strong market growth with hugely underserved supply in areas with demand. And that's a key point. There's a dynamic at play in plastic surgery that's novel, something that I haven't seen in any other subset of healthcare, in which there are vastly underserved areas in this country in terms of plastic surgeon density with incredibly high demand for plastic surgery. So targeting those areas and identifying the areas that we can go into with low capital expenditure is an important component of the platform that I'm proposing here. And I'll get into that in the next slide more. Now, in terms of the challenges, plastic surgery is far from a perfect asset. There are definitely things that are difficult about it that we have to be aware of. The one that I have the most experience with, that I've noticed most personally, is this dynamic where plastic surgeons are some of the most significantly compensated MDs out there relative to their peers. In 2019, they were the highest paid. In 2020, they were a close second. And so what does that mean for us? Well, it means that pitching a normalization of salary can be difficult. when these plastic surgeons are pulling away millions of dollars by taking 40 to 45% of top line on a yearly basis when they're privatized, it can be a tough sell to tell them, hey, let's take 20% and we'll give you rollover equity in an earnout structure. And a lot of times people have a difficult time conceptualizing that loss going from 45% to 20%. And of course, the experiences that I've had is, it's definitely maneuverable. You can explain to them that 20% of a top line that's growing at a 17, 18, 19% compound annual growth rate is going to be significant compared to taking 40 to 45% staying stagnant or moving at a 5 to 6% growth that you have historically. And then also getting them to buy into the exit strategy is key. Understanding what's at risk, what's at play at the end for them is massive. And as long as you can explain those two things, I think you successfully combat this issue. Moving on to the social stigma, this is something that I talked about as a driver for why the market is increasing year over year. It's still an issue though, relative to other specialties in medicine. There is a stigma that accompanies choosing to have an elective aesthetic procedure. And while I think that's decreasing, it's still there and it's worth noting. Now, in terms of complication rates in plastic surgery aren't especially high relative to other subsets of medicine. But what is true about complication rates in plastic surgery are that they're noticeable. People who have complications of plastic surgery fear what's going to happen to their physical appearance. And the fear there is justified, in my opinion. And I think the way of combating that is simple. KVLR has no interest in acquiring, volume mill plastic surgery groups, ones who churn out massive volume of procedures and pay a price in terms of quality of care. It's not what we're involved in. It's not what we're interested in. And it's certainly not what I'm interested in either. So I think combating this is as simple as making sure that we partner with really high quality physicians who care more about performing really high quality medical services at a premium rather than churning out as much volume as possible and letting their level of professionality decrease as a result. Now, non-invasive cosmetic surgery is increasingly being practiced by other physicians. And in my opinion, this is the biggest threat to the revenue side of things for plastic surgery here over the next 5 to 7 years. 15% of revenue for plastic surgeons typically comes from the non-invasive and non-surgicals. And so it's a minority, but it's still a significant portion, and it's worth mentioning. A trend over the last 5 to 6 years has been primary care and dermatologists beginning to incorporate some of these non-surgical cosmetic procedures into their routine. And so kind of a portion of the medical landscape that plastic surgeons had a monopoly over for decades is slowly being taken away. And while it's a minority, it's still there, and it's important to understand the way the market's going. So certainly focusing on practices that really prioritize the surgical side of things, who make the most of their money from that, I think is a smart bet moving forward. And then lastly, of course, healthcare is significantly regulated. Nothing new there. We were very aware of that, and there's ways of combating that. I think relative to my platform, something that I offer that I'll get into on the next slide is essentially prioritizing markets that aren't CPOM regulated. So understanding that we can actually go out and acquire actual physical practices, physician practices, rather than having to do the MSO structure is certainly attractive. Less regulation makes things easier for us and a little bit easier at exit as well. But I don't think that should be a defining characteristic of choosing to get into a market or not. It's just an added benefit. So the opportunity. The last big strength that I hit on in terms of plastic surgery was this really novel dynamic that exists in the marketplace, in which you have really high demand in areas met with incredibly low supply. And you can see that basically demonstrated across the 3 maps of the US on the bottom. On the left, we see the Google relative search volume, which is a really strong indicator of interest in plastic surgery. And you can see really no surprises there. California being the strongest, places like Texas, Florida, the Northeast also very strong. But what's really interesting is when you superimpose that upon the middle one, the blue one, which shows the surgical density, the plastic surgeons per 10,000 of the population, there's actually an incredible discrepancy that appears on the far right, where you see there are incredibly high amounts of plastic surgery demand in areas where there's very little supply. And those are the target markets for me. I'm under no impression in this situation that KVLR wants to shell out, 8, 9, 10, $20 million per acquisition, something we might be comfortable doing on the national scale currently. So in this situation, I was basically tasked with creating value elsewhere. How do I overcome potential when we're looking at a situation where a very small capital expenditure relative to others in the market is being wagered? And for me, by far, the best way of doing so that I could find was taking advantage of this really interesting dynamic of supply and demand. One of the simplest concepts in economics, but one that is playing out in plastic surgery and offers us a really incredible opportunity. So we know the market's growing at a really steady rate, and a rate that outperforms their competitors. But still, many areas across the country are vastly underserved, and there's significant demand met with very insignificant supply. And so by calculating surgical demand index, we can identify high potential markets that will facilitate organic growth and present the unique opportunity to meet demand without massive capital infusion relative to other acquisitions we're making in the platform. So KBLR can essentially hedge their bet. They can minimize capital risk and taking advantage of underserved markets, bank on organic growth by meeting the supply with high level demand, and essentially build a platform that leverages this really interesting dynamic in the market without having to spend tens of millions of dollars at the point of acquisition. So for the target markets, there were essentially three key demographics that I was able to isolate in plastic surgery that I think are incredibly useful in terms of determining where we should break into for this platform. The first is the surgical demand index. I've touched on that. It's a combination of calculating the demand based off Google relative search volume in a state, the surgical density in a state, and then basically combining those figures to understand where the highest demand exists for plastic surgery patients. And so that's an incredibly important statistic. There's been a few studies conducted on it, and it's very accurate and extremely exciting in terms of informing where these new ventures should take place, especially if we're talking about a dynamic where in which we're not trying to acquire a top dog in a massive market like Miami or Chicago or LA, and instead looking to acquire an established group with high potential in a market that we think is going to continue to grow and expand, where in which an incredible amount of demand exists and not a lot of competition is there. So the barrier to entry is low, and us coming in and being able to eliminate operational inefficiencies, implement a growth strategy, we can take advantage of this incredible demand without much competition. Now, the second key demographic is college-educated women. And this is an interesting one because, of course, women make up between 80 and 85% of plastic surgery patients. But a number of studies that I use for reference here actually showed that of that 80 to 85, 67% of the trial were college-educated women, women with college degrees. And that compared to the corresponding census data from that same year of 30%. So we see this really interesting discrepancy between those two figures that indicates a really positive correlation here, something worth noting. College-educated women are making up a huge portion of the plastic surgery population, and we can actually measure that on a state-by-state basis and understand where the highest potential for population growth exists in terms of potential patients for plastic surgery. So that's another important component to consider. And then the last is GDP, understanding that plastic surgery is, of course, elective, a vast majority is, and people who have disposable income on a GDP basis are great indicators of markets that are going to have high demand for plastic surgery. The average patient falls outside of a +1 standard deviation of the mean of GDP, and it's because disposable income equals an ability to have an elective aesthetic procedure. And so you calculate all that out, and the 6 states that I identify to be the most ideal for this specific strategy and the platform that I'm pitching are Wyoming, Oklahoma, Iowa, Washington, Nevada, and Texas. They're ones who differ in terms of their values and their strengths. A good example here, you look at GDP growth by state, another important characteristic to consider. 3 of these 6 states that I'm identifying in the top 10, Washington being number 1. In terms of the Californian exodus rate, I mean, that's an important statistic to consider as well, because we all know that Californians are the poster child of plastic surgery, certainly the highest density in terms of demand for plastic surgery at any state. And as these people leave California and enter other states, they change the social dynamics of the area. They change the stigmatization, they change the market expectation for plastic surgery. They bring with them an exponential effect of people considering it once their friends do as well. And so understanding where that dynamic is shifting to is also a very important metric to count. And of course, 3 of the 6 here that I've identified are in the top 5, Texas being 1, Nevada being 3, and Washington being 4. So moving on here to the strategy. Now, I think one of the really cool things about the strategy is that it's all time series. It's all completely predicated upon when the exit strategy is and how far away we are from it. So phase 1 occurs across 2 years. There'll be 2 acquisitions in the Wyoming, Nevada, Washington areas, that Western United States area, a place that we have very little plastic surgery expansion into currently with KVLR, California being the only anomaly there. And so this phase prioritizes a long-term growth strategy. I think these locations are perfect for a situation of a growth strategy where in which we essentially bring on 3, 4, 5 additional surgeons for these 2 acquisitions. And the reason being is that, this is a long-term growth strategy. And the reality is, you onboard 3 surgeons into a facility, they're not going to pay you back right away. It's going to take, the average really, really good surgeon might take 3 years to reach capacity in terms of patient load, but on average, it's closer to 5 years. So this isn't a growth strategy we want to implement in phase 3, where we're 2 years away from exit. We want to implement this early on, where we understand that we're actually going to realize the maximum return on our investment in a 5-year period from where we actually incur that cost. So I think it's a very smart way of executing a growth strategy early on. And I think the West is a perfect place to do it. You're talking about places like Nevada and Washington, especially, that I think might be key places where KBLR doesn't have any geographic influence over currently in the plastic surgery market, places with very high surgical demand index, places where GDP is increasing rapidly, places that I think are going to be high potential markets for us to start getting involved in here soon. Phase two occurs over 2023 to 2025, with 2 more acquisitions taking place in the Texas and Oklahoma markets. Now, I've identified this subset of the geography of the country to be really a perfect time to start investing in that space in this time period. I think this is one of those situations that would benefit from a very quick merger. I think maybe the end of 2025 would be the time to consider merging these 2 groups together in this space and really taking over market share. Texas, I think Oklahoma and Texas are both unique in the sense of the value they provide. Oklahoma ranking 2nd in the entire country in plastic surgery demand index. Texas ranking 14th, but having one of the quickest growing GDPs of the country, one of the quickest California exodus rates in the country, and one of the states that previously had one of the highest social stigmatizations about plastic surgery that's rapidly falling day by day. So I think phase 2 here, a merger scenario where in which we combine maybe one has a really good ambulatory surgical center, the other has a few physicians, we merge those together, and then a 4-year investment horizon there. I think we maximize returns before exit. And then phase 3. Now, this is a phase that basically is broken down into 2 components. The first is reading real-time data, understanding which of the 2 platforms that we've now built in the West and the Texas and Oklahoma markets are going to benefit the most from an additional bolt-on acquisition. Maybe there's one that's more established, one that we think has higher potential and more demand than we can meet with supply, and we bolt on one there, or maybe one has one with really fantastic infrastructure, and we understand that adding another surgical component could be the difference between growth of 15% and 20%. So that's a decision we make in real time, depending on the performance of these 2 platforms we've created. And then the other component to this is understanding that this isn't a scenario that we're looking to facilitate long-term growth in. In phase 3, we're 2 years from exit. And we're not looking to bolt on 3 or 4 physicians and have them running 40% capacity by the time we exit. We want a situation where growth is quick, a couple-year period of time. Maybe the potential for growth isn't as high, but we know a short-term growth strategy will work, and we can provide significant value to the platform at exit within that time frame. Now, on the upper hand right, you'll see kind of a breakdown of a potential acquisition schedule. Now, for these calculations, I was as conservative as I could possibly be. I basically assumed that KVLR was unwilling to shell out much money at all per acquisition. In fact, under $1 million per acquisition, which is significantly lower than what we currently do in the platform. But it was important to me to basically assume the most conservative perspective so I could ensure that I could basically illustrate the value add. So I'm essentially assuming here around $4.7 million spent over a 5 acquisition period in initial acquisition pricing, and then around $10.5 million at exit in terms of baseline EBITDA. That's assuming a very slightly higher than market compound annual growth rate, but not one that I think is going to be indicative of what I can do. I'm very confident that I can do better, but I wanted once again to be as conservative as possible to show the payout. And then exit. The exit's the really fun part in all this. And of course, it was the very first thing that I thought of when this idea came to me. Really, the beautiful thing I think about this idea is that the value add for KVLR is so significant. If we're assuming that KVLR is going to exit at $100 million top line, which equates to around a $30 million combined adjusted EBITDA, we're talking somewhere between 8 and 12 multiple. I assume 12 to be generous. We're looking at $360 million at exit. My platform, if we exit at 10.5 million EBITDA, which I think is a very conservative estimate, something that I think I can beat, we're looking at maybe a 6 to 7x multiple, equating to $73 million. Now, you combine the 2 platforms together at exit, you're talking about 40.5 million bottom line adjusted EBITDA, multiple at 15x, looking at $607 million. The addition of a $10 million EBITDA to the platform already not only increase our bottom line multiple amount, but it would actually increase the multiple we garner from the investment to do business with. So the value add to KVLR is significant. Our interests are aligned throughout the entirety of the process, and nothing should change at exit. Now, the vision. We talked a little bit here about the acquisitions, targeting high potential markets like Wyoming, Washington, Oklahoma, Iowa, Texas, and Nevada. Understanding that, in order for us to make up this initial loss in terms of capital, we're not willing to expend for acquisition. We're not going to go out there and buy the top dogs in giant markets and consolidate market share in massive cities with really established, large-scale, multi-physician groups. We're looking to spend less money. And so the only way to combat that, the way that I identified is the best way to create value is by identifying these markets with the highest potential. The growth that I think is going to happen the second we meet the demand, excuse me. We're also going to identify physicians we believe in, who value growth, expansion, innovation. This is a lesson that I've learned throughout doing, the platform building with KVLR up to this point. Understanding that, having aligned interests, sharing values with the physician partners that we go into business with is critical. Ensuring that these people aren't there just to, get a initial acquisition price and bounce. People who want to be involved in this for the next 5 to 7 years. People who hold themselves to a high standard. People who consider themselves to be high potential individuals and their practices to be high potential practices. And with our help, we can make it that way. So that's an important characteristic to identify for these acquisitions. We're going to prioritize groups with hard assets like surgical facilities and equipment. Nothing changes between that and what KVLR currently does. It's a great way to mitigate risk, a great way for us to know exactly what we're acquiring. The value is much more straight line. It's something we can bank on, instead of hoping the cash and bank accounts are going to translate. And then lastly, this is an important kind of differentiator between my platform and that KVLR is building, targeting single or double MD practices that offer growth opportunity at a discounted price. Now, the difference here is, of course, obvious. Typically, KVLR looks to have multi-physician groups. And while that may be a little less true in the plastic surgery platform, I think it's still true. And the reason for that is simple. We want to mitigate our risk. If we're acquiring a group and half of the physicians leave, we suddenly lost half the value we acquired. So it's a trade-off. It's a risk that I'm assuming within this platform. But the reason for that is, I think, strong. In my mind, the choice to expend less capital initially at the point of acquisition leaves us with three choices. We can either assume that by compromising the quality of care that we're going to acquire. Paying less because the quality of care these physicians are providing, their skill level is suboptimal. And for me, that's a non-starter. I have no interest in getting involved with people like that, and I know KVLR doesn't either. The second option that we have is basically sacrificing growth potential for a lower acquisition price. Once again, a non-starter for me. A lot of this platform that I'm pitching is predicated upon executing successful growth strategies in markets that are primed and ready for that to occur. And so sacrificing that is of no interest to me. So that leaves basically being forced to be saddled with one or two physician groups, which I think is the right trade-off to make. I think I can combat that both by including earnout structures and rollover equity in the actual acquisition agreements, which is KVLR market standard, but also the growth strategies that I'm implementing are the increase of surgical demand, increasing surgeons in a facility, increasing the number of surgeons within a practice, trying to dissipate that risk a little bit and mitigate it to the best degree possible. But like I said, if you have to make a trade-off somewhere when you're initially starting off with a less capital being invested into initial acquisition, I think this is the place to make it instead of compromising level of service or potential. Moving on to growth, Medi-Spa and extenders, important components here of any acquisition we're making. I either want them to be included in the acquisition already or have the physicians there being amenable to their addition. We know that extenders can add a 15% to revenue top line right off the bat. I've spoken with physician practices in the past who have no interest in that, and that's a huge concern for us because it's a very easy and simple way for us to increase top line quickly, and certainly one that I want to instigate early on in the acquisition process. Targeting inefficiencies, combating them with economies of scale, normalization of salary, things that we're doing already with KVLR that I want to continue. I want to implement a dynamic video and social media presence. A conversation that I've had with David on multiple occasions is how plastic surgery really does lend itself more so than any other specialty in healthcare to visual marketing. Having before and after testimonials, having videos of patients providing testimonials about their experience at the plastic surgery group and how it changed their lives. Really powerful things that should be used, should be leveraged in marketing for these groups. And they don't help us gain market penetration. It'll help create brands. It'll help destigmatize the entire practice of plastic surgery. An important component to consider. Strategic MD additions. This is something that I touched on in the previous slide. Understanding when adding MDs is an important growth strategy and when it's not. Doing so early on in the investment horizon where you can actually realize the returns over a 5-year period to where these physicians are suddenly ramped up to 100% capacity instead of incurring the costs and selling when they're at 50%. Being smart and strategic about the growth strategies we implement, a key important factor here in this platform. And then last, the implementation of a training hours program. One of the thoughts that I had was, we're talking about markets like Nevada or Oklahoma or Wyoming to potentially get into. They might be less desirable compared to places like Miami or California or Chicago. And because of that, it's important that we can actually entice high-level physicians to come out to these areas and provide a high level of care to these practices. And one way to do that is by already harnessing the power of a residency requirement for physicians, which is getting training hours in. So incorporating a program into these practices not only allows us to cultivate relationships with young physicians, but it also incentivizes them to consider these additional markets as places for them to relocate to for the next 5 to 7 years. Now the exit, I touched on that pretty well on the last slide, but we're looking to merge with KVLR at exit. I think the strategies and the interests are perfectly aligned. There's no reason not to do so at exit. Increasing that bottom line, garnering a higher multiple. It's a huge value add to KVLR, and I think it makes the most sense. The 5 to 7 year investment horizon stays the same as KVLR's. And the big goal there is providing a higher EBITDA multiple at the platform exit. Now, in terms of goals, by far the most important one to me is providing tangible value.
I have that perspective of getting to grow up in a healthcare family, getting to watch my dad start two practices, sell one off, and deal with all of the hardships and the successes that accompany that. And like I said at the very beginning, the dynamic that I've gotten to witness firsthand is that dynamic of a physician who was willing to go into debt and willing to sacrifice years and years of education and training um, to help people because he wants to see patients. They want to provide value in the patients' lives. And that gets taken away from them when they're suddenly forced to run their business as well. And it's a dynamic where in which they want to give both things 100% and they end up giving each one 50. And so I understand from that perspective the value add. But I also understand after working at KVLR, the actual tangible value that we can provide physicians. And so it's very important to me to continue doing so, communicating that to these physicians at the point of acquisition, and then actually following through over the next 5 to 7 years. I want to beat the market compound annual growth rate. It's a very simple goal, a goal that KVLR already does. In my mind, if I'm not doing that, then I'm failing. I'm not providing enough value to these groups. So I have every intention of beating the market compound annual growth rate by a significant margin. I want to execute creative acquisitions, utilizing this kind of real estate perspective, understanding where the potential in the markets exists, understanding when to enact growth strategies depending on time series relative to exit, all important things, all important strategic elements to being successful in this platform and maximizing value with minimal initial capital investment. And then lastly, creating significant value to the KVLR platform at exit, understanding that the value that I'm pitching here is unique relative to any other asset that can be pitched. The ability to increase not only the baseline EBITDA, but also the multiple being garnered. Huge value adds to KVLR, and I think aligns our interests perfectly. And to finish off, why me? Which I think might be one of the most important components of all of this. At the end of the day, KVLR is investing in a market, an asset class, a growth strategy, an exit strategy, all of that. But I would argue more importantly, KVLR is investing in an individual. They're identifying somebody that they believe is going to be successful and stop at nothing to make sure that happens. Somebody to really and truly safeguard what is the opportunity of a lifetime and make the most of it. I think it comes down to that. It's an opportunity that didn't have to be given, and it's being given to give somebody a huge chance to make something of themselves and to be significant in a market. And if there's anything I can say with a level of conviction today, is that I firmly believe that person's me. I think there's a few reasons why. I mean, relative to this asset class, I think my upbringing with my dad being a physician with practices has lent me a lot of perspective in this space, understanding exactly what the challenges physicians face are in that practice situation, and then understanding the value that I can provide them from a private equity standpoint after having 2 months of experience here at KVLR. On a more tangible side of things, in terms of education and availability, a huge component of this is being able to actually give enough of yourself to make it successful. This opportunity is too great for it to be anything less than priority 1, 2, and 3 in my life, and that's certainly how I regard it. Should I be lucky enough to have it? Thankfully, I was lucky enough to front load every difficult course that I had left my junior year, to where I'm taking art classes and divisionals and minimal hours and minimal effort this senior year. So that's of no concern to me. And to be perfectly candid, if there ever came a point in time where I felt like I was unable to give every second, every minute of time and effort and energy to this opportunity, then I would very quickly move part-time or go online, do whatever it took to make sure that I can make the most of this opportunity and do right by KVLR and the people that I'm now working with. From an organizational leadership standpoint, why should I be tapped to lead an organization? It's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer because at the end of the day, we're coming from a perspective of very little leadership experience in the business world. But what I can say definitively is that I regard myself to be a leader. I understand the value in listening first, speaking second, taking in perspectives. I think I'm a leader who sets an example by how hard I work. I think I've done that from day one here at KVLR, raising the standard of those around me by ensuring that I hold myself to the highest standard possible, and nothing will change there should I be tapped for this. And then, of course, in providing value, I understand that intimately. I understand both sides of it. I have a well-rounded perspective of the value that private equity can provide because I've lived both sides of it. So not only do I understand it, not only am I capable of identifying it, after my time at KVLR, I feel very confident that I can deliver it as well. In terms of experience, I've been lucky enough to have experience professionally on both sides of the aisle. I've gone to intern with healthcare professionals, private practices throughout my life. One being a really powerful experience that I had with a pain management clinic that did spinal surgeries in Tennessee. And while I was there working on the business side of things, they got hit with federal regulations of basically decreased opiate prescription rates. And it was a huge deal to them because around 35 to 40% of their revenue came from these prescription rates of opiates, pain management. And I was there and got to experience in real time a way of combating genuine adversity and seeing how you go about doing that from a professional side of things. And I think I gained a lot of insight in that respect, as well as actually on the ground experience, seeing how these practices are run, combining that with my experience with my dad in a lifetime of living in that world. I feel very confident that I have a well-trained perspective in that regard. And then of course now my time with KVLR Capital, like I said earlier, essentially the entirety of my experience here has been building this national platform. I have every bit of confidence that KVLR is going to reach that $100 million top line with or without me. But what I can say is that I've had a large part of doing it with them so far, and it's been incredibly fun and motivational and learning, a huge learning experience for me. And so I have a tremendous amount of confidence in being able to replicate that on a smaller scale and merging with the platform at exit and providing real value to KVLR. I've had a hand in every part of it, from sourcing deals to communicating with these surgeons to facilitating meetings to reviewing financials, doing DCFs, doing adjusted EBITDA calculations, putting together a proposal, negotiating that proposal. We're in a situation now where we have multiple negotiations on their way in plastic surgery. We have interest in places like Miami and Chicago, and more coming in the pipeline, 6 more today in California. I have a lot of confidence in my ability to do this efficiently and effectively. And I think the experience I've had on both sides of the aisle is invaluable relative to this experience. And the last thing I'll say is, my personal makeup. I think this is an opportunity that asks a lot of a person, and you have to be willing to sacrifice a tremendous amount of yourself for it. But I have a lot of confidence that I'm made of the right stuff for this. I think I am. I'm an incredibly resilient person. I left home at the age of 14, lived by myself since then. I understand how to deal with adversity with a level of autonomy and responsibility that I don't think many people do my age. I'm very comfortable with being able to remove myself from a situation, viewing things from an objective point of view, triaging a situation, understanding the things that I can make better in the short term, understanding the corrections to make in the long term to ensure adversity doesn't strike again, and making the most of bad situations. I've experienced doing that, and I have all the confidence in the world that I can continue doing so if I get this opportunity. And lastly, I'm an incredibly determined person. I think that's been evident from day one here at KVLR. I've never been a person who's satisfied with meeting an expectation or meeting the bare minimum or checking a box. I wanted to be the best from day one, and I recognized that I would get as much out of this opportunity as I was willing to put in. And because of that, I've been unwilling to settle for anything less than everything I had every day. And I think the results speak for themselves, and I'm proud of that performance. But all I can say is if there's any level of impressiveness from that experience, and I can tell you that it'll only be ramped up should I get this opportunity. Lastly, for purpose, this is the big driver for me. It's the reason why I went with this as my pitch. It's the reason why I had so much conviction in it. And it's the reason why I hope I'm lucky enough to actually enact this strategy, because I feel like this purpose has been cultivated my entire life. Growing up with my dad and getting to see him and his private practice experiences, and then getting to have professional experience on both sides of the aisle, and now landing at KVLR where I actually get to live that value day in and day out and see how we do it. I understand the purpose that's there. I understand the value that we can provide these physicians. I understand the value we can provide patients by allowing physicians to focus on what they do best, which is providing high levels of care. And that's the purpose that I see for myself. It's why I'm motivated every day to work hard. It's why I've been successful at KVLR. And it's why I believe that should I get this opportunity, I will be successful in this venture as well. So with that said, thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it. Happy to answer any questions you have.
Really astounding work, Hunter. I think you've prepared for it at a very high level, and you've set a high level of standards for this presentation for the Quantum Leap project. I really don't think you could have done a better job making this presentation a success. You've clearly learned the market, you've done your research, you've done your analysis, and you've built out a model for yourself that will be parallel to KVLR Capital's model, but certainly has a unique approach because you're looking to serve within the underserved areas for plastic surgery specialties in those states that clearly have the demand but don't have the supply needed. I'm impressed, to say the least, but I'm also lost for words because this is the first that we've ever had a project such as this be available and accessible to our analysts. But I think this has certainly been the best decision I've ever made in order for us to listen in and see the perspective of our analysts on a marketplace that they feel will be successful in the near future. I really want to open this up for our team to ask any questions, but really thank you. With a lot of respect, I have to say you could not have done a better job making a presentation and putting together this Quantum Leap project for everyone to experience. Thanks. All right, any questions? We know that the bar has been set high based on just the amount of preparation put into this project. Any comments, any remarks? We have presentations all throughout this week. So tomorrow we have Orist, and Orist is with us today. And then thereafter, every single day we're going to have a presentation. So I'm excited to see what everyone is coming to the table with. Then we have Justin on Wednesday. We have, I think, Josh on Thursday. We have Friday, Paul. So guys, get ready, prepare, do present, perhaps in the mirror, or feel free to utilize this room when it's not being utilized, and record yourself, making sure that you're able to present at your best. Hunter, any last comments? How was your experience overall? I know that you weren't nervous because you and I spoke earlier today, so that's excellent from the perspective of professionalism. But what was the entire experience like putting together this presentation? I'm not sure if you're on mute. I'm not hearing you on your end.
Yeah, check
Okay,
your mic
so,
settings.
So I think Hunter's mic worked for the entire purpose of the presentation, and then it just went out on him. And if you guys notice, in the middle of the presentation, the volume actually did change, and I wasn't certain whether or not that was Zoom's responsibility or something has gone wrong on our end or my end. Hunter, feel free to jump back in to the Zoom meeting. We're certainly all here for the time being. Any questions, guys, while we have Hunter rejoining? Any questions about this meeting, about your presentations coming up this week?
I thought you did a great job representing the demand and the supply and how that's your focus. So, yeah, great job, man. That was really solid. I gotta say, yeah. We still can't hear you, by the way.
I think Hunter is still having complications with the mic situation. So that being said, let's resume for the 4:30 analyst meeting. As we always do, feel free to reach out via Podio or text if there's anything I can do to help. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I think Hunter's very much pleased that everyone was able to join in and listen and support. And I'm delighted to see each of you present for the next few days, actually for the entire week. So hopefully you all had a great rest over the weekend and are well prepared. Thank you to all, and talk to you at 4:30. Be well, everyone. Bye-bye.